Kethvari had lived for 400 years, and in all that time, the Silithan ambassador had never understood why other species made such strange faces when danger came near them. The crystalline being stood at the observation deck of the constellation Accord, watching the stars burn cold and distant beyond the glass, and thinking about the newest members of the Galactic Coalition, the humans. They were such odd creatures, these humans, with their soft skin and their loud voices, and their strange habit of making water leak from their eyes when emotions grew too strong inside them. Kethvari's people had evolved on a paradise world where nothing hunted them and nothing threatened them, and so the Silithan had never developed what other species called fear, and they had never needed to understand it. But now, as warning lights began to flash red throughout the station, Kethvari would learn what fear truly meant. The message came from the outer rim of known space, from a survey team that had been exploring dead worlds where ancient things slept beneath the rock and ice. All stations, emergency broadcast, the communication system announced, and every being on the constellation Accord stopped what they were doing to listen. The footage played on every screen throughout the station, and Kethvari watched with the same calm curiosity that defined the Silithan species. Scientists from 12 different species stood in an underground chamber, their equipment beeping and their lights cutting through darkness that seemed too thick, too hungry, too alive. Then something changed in their faces, something Kethvari did not have a word for, and the scientists began to scream. They clawed at their own faces with fingers and claws and tentacles, and they turned on each other with violence that made no sense, and their screams grew louder until the transmission cut to static. Around Kethvari, the other ambassadors and delegates began to react in ways the Silithan found deeply confusing. The Draconoth warriors gripped their ceremonial blades and looked at shadows that held nothing dangerous. The hive-minded Kethril clustered together so tightly that their bodies pressed against each other until they could barely breathe. The ancient Vorax elders made sounds of distress and began shuffling toward the escape pods with speed their old bodies should not have possessed. "What is happening?" Kethvari asked a nearby coalition scientist, a being with 4 arms and skin that changed color based on emotion. Right now that skin had turned the pale white of absolute terror. "A thought feeder," the scientist whispered, and the words came out broken and shaking. "Something from before the coalition existed, something we thought was extinct, something that eats minds by using their own fears against them." Kethvari processed this information with the cold logic of the Silithan mind, but the ambassador did not understand why everyone was running, why the station had erupted into chaos, why beings who had faced war and disaster were now fleeing like prey animals. "It is coming here," the scientist continued, "drawn to us, drawn to all the minds gathered in one place, and nothing can stop it, nothing can fight it, nothing can survive what it does to thinking beings." The evacuation began within minutes, and ships launched from every dock as species that had been enemies for centuries now fled together toward safety that might not exist. Kethvari watched them go with something that might have been curiosity, or might have been the first tiny seed of an emotion the Silithan had no name for. But not everyone was running. The human delegation had gathered in the main corridor, and they were not moving toward the escape pods, they were moving toward the armory. Admiral Yuki Tanaka stood at the center of her people, a small woman with gray in her black hair and lines on her face that spoke of years spent making difficult choices, and she was giving orders in a voice that cut through the chaos like a blade. "All combat personnel, full tactical gear," she commanded. "All non-combat personnel, support positions, medical stations, communication arrays, we are not leaving." Kethvari approached the human delegation with steps that rang like bells against the metal floor, and the ambassador's crystalline body caught the red emergency lights and scattered them into rainbows. Admiral Tanaka, Kithvari said. The entity approaches, and all other species are evacuating, so why do your people remain? The Admiral looked at the Scythian ambassador with eyes that held something fierce and burning, something that Kithvari would later learn was called determination. Because someone has to, Tanaka replied, and her voice did not shake even though the lights flickered, and the station groaned as if something vast was pressing against its hull from outside. But the thought feeder cannot be fought, Kithvari said. It attacks the mind itself. It uses fear as a weapon, and no species in coalition history has ever survived contact with it. A young human soldier nearby laughed at this, actually laughed, and the sound was sharp and strange in the midst of so much terror. Fear as a weapon, the soldier said, and Kithvari would later learn his name was Diego Reyes. That thing picked the wrong station to attack. Admiral Tanaka placed a hand on Kithvari's crystalline shoulder, and her touch was warm where the Scythian's body was cool. Ambassador, you should evacuate with the others, but if you choose to stay, stay behind us. I do not understand, Kithvari admitted. How can you face something that weaponizes terror itself? The Admiral smiled then, and it was not a happy smile but something sharper and older, and full of a history that Kithvari knew nothing about. We have met fear before, Admiral Tanaka said as her soldiers formed up behind her, and weapons hummed to life and boots stamped against metal floors. We grew up with it, we evolved alongside it, and we learned a long time ago that being afraid does not mean you have to stop moving. She turned to address everyone who remained on the station, the humans in their armor, the few aliens too confused or too slow to evacuate, and one crystalline ambassador who stayed because curiosity was the only strong drive the Scythian possessed. Anyone who stays, Admiral Tanaka announced, and her voice rang through the corridors like a declaration of war, stays behind us, because tonight we remind the universe what humanity does when the darkness comes. We light it on fire. The humans cheered, and Kithvari felt the vibrations of their voices resonating through the crystalline structure of the ambassador's body. And somewhere in the vast cold space beyond the station, something ancient and hungry began to realize that its prey was not running. The hours passed slowly as the station transformed around Kithvari, and the Scythian ambassador watched with growing fascination as the humans worked. They built barriers in the corridors using anything they could find, and they set up medical stations in rooms that had once held diplomatic meetings, and they checked their weapons again and again with hands that moved fast and sure. Kithvari found a place near a group of human soldiers who were resting before the battle, and the ambassador listened as they talked among themselves. You ever face anything like this before? A young woman asked, and her voice trembled just a little at the edges. Nothing like this, an older man replied. But I was at the Kepler station disaster when the reactors failed, and I thought I was going to die every second for 6 hours straight. How did you survive? The young woman asked. The older man shrugged his shoulders in that strange human gesture that meant so many things at once. I just kept moving, he said. Kept doing the next thing that needed doing, kept telling myself I could fall apart later. And you know what? I never did fall apart, because by the time later came, I had already survived. Corporal Diego Reyes sat down next to Kithvari, and the young soldier offered the ambassador a container of water, even though they both knew the Scythian did not drink. You stayed, Diego said, and there was respect in his voice. I wish to observe, Kithvari replied. My species does not understand fear, and I believed this would be an opportunity to study the phenomenon. Diego laughed, and the sound was warm despite everything. You want to understand fear? Let me tell you about where humans come from. And so Diego talked, and other humans gathered around to add their own words, and Kithvari learned things about humanity that no Scythian had ever known. The human homeworld was a place called Earth, and it was what the galaxy classified as a death world, a planet where everything wanted to kill you, where predators hunted in the tall grass and poison hid in beautiful flowers, and the weather itself could end your life without warning. Our ancestors were not the strongest animals, Diego explained, and they were not the fastest or the biggest, and they had no claws or fangs or armor. How did they survive? Kithvari asked. Fear, Diego said simply. They survived because they were afraid, because fear told them when to run and when to hide, and when to fight with everything they had. An older soldier named Sergeant Chen joined the conversation, and she told stories of ancient human history that made Kithvari's crystalline mind struggle to process what it was hearing. She spoke of humans who hunted animals 10 times their size, driving them off cliffs and chasing them for days until the beasts dropped from exhaustion. She spoke of humans who built shelters against storms that could flatten forests, who crossed oceans on boats made of wood, who walked into frozen wastelands and burning deserts and the deepest caves because they wanted to know what was there. Every time we did these things, Sergeant Chen said, we were afraid, we were terrified, our bodies screamed at us to run and hide, but we did the thing anyway. This does not make sense, Kithvari said. If fear tells you to flee, why would you not flee? Diego leaned forward with his hands clasped together, and his eyes were bright with something the ambassador could not name. Because fear is not our master, he said. Fear is our advisor, and sometimes we listen to it, and sometimes we tell it to shut up while we do what needs doing. The humans called this ability courage, but their translation devices struggled to explain the concept to Kithvari, because the Scythian language had no word for choosing to act despite terror. How could you have a word for something your species had never experienced? A medical officer named Dr. Sarah Park came to check on the soldiers, and she added her own piece to the puzzle that Kithvari was trying to solve. Our bodies are designed to fight through fear, she explained. When we get scared, our hearts beat faster and our muscles get stronger and our minds get sharper. Evolution turned our terror into fuel. Kithvari thought about this for a long time, processing the information through crystalline neural pathways that had been designed for logic and analysis. You are saying, the ambassador said slowly, that humans became the dominant species of their death world not despite their fear, but because of it. Now you are getting it, Diego said with a grin. The station shook then just a little, and everyone went quiet. The entity was getting closer, and even through the walls of the station, sensitive beings could feel something pressing against their minds, something cold and vast and hungry. One by one, the aliens who had remained began to collapse. A Kethril delegate fell to the ground and curled into a ball, making sounds of distress that Kithvari had never heard from that species before. A Draconoth warrior dropped his blade and began to weep, covering his face with his clawed hands. A Vorax elder simply stopped moving, standing frozen like a statue as her mind retreated from something too terrible to face. The humans felt it too, Kithvari could see it in their faces, in the way their skin grew pale and their hands began to shake and their eyes went wide. Diego's breathing grew fast and rough, and sweat appeared on his forehead, and his hands trembled as he gripped his weapon. Are you well? Kithvari asked. No, Diego admitted, and his voice was honest in a way that surprised the ambassador. I am terrified, more scared than I have ever been in my entire life. Then why do you not flee? Diego looked at the crystalline being beside him, and he smiled even though his whole body was shaking with fear. Being scared means I am still thinking, he said, means I am still me, and as long as I am still me, I can still choose what to do. He stood up on legs that trembled, and he offered his hand to help Kithvari rise. Fear is just a feeling, Diego said, and feelings pass, but what we do while we are feeling them, that is what matters, that is what lasts, that is what makes us who we are. The lights of the station flickered, and somewhere in the distance, something screamed, whether it was the station itself or the minds of beings who could not handle what was touching them. HFY did not know. And then, for the first time in 400 years of existence, the Sci-Fi ambassador felt something cold crawl through the crystal pathways of their mind. It was fear, true fear, and it was coming. The thought feeder did not enter the station through doors or walls. It entered through minds. One moment, the corridors of the constellation Accord were filled with red emergency lights and the sounds of people preparing for battle. And the next moment reality itself began to crack and bend and twist. HFY felt it first as a wrongness in the patterns of light that reflected through the ambassador's crystalline body, as if the photons themselves had become sick and confused. Then the visions came. The Sci-Fi saw the perfect order of the universe dissolving into chaos, saw crystals crumbling to dust, saw the beautiful mathematical patterns that governed reality falling apart into meaningless noise. For a species that had built their entire civilization on logic and structure, this was horror beyond description. HFY froze, every crystalline process stopping at once, unable to move or think or even remember that movement and thought were possible. All around the station, other species faced their own private nightmares. The Kethral hive mind began to fragment, and individuals who had never been alone in their entire lives suddenly felt the connection to their collective dissolving like mist in sunlight. They screamed with voices that had never learned to scream alone, and some of them simply stopped living because their hearts did not know how to beat without the rhythm of the hive to guide them. The proud Draconith warriors saw visions of dishonor and shame, saw themselves betraying their clans and abandoning their duties, saw their ancestors turning away in disgust. They clawed at their own scales trying to tear away the shame they felt, and their roars of anguish echoed through the corridors. The ancient Vorix watched themselves crumbling to dust, watched the universe move on without them and forget they had ever existed, watched everything they had built and learned and loved becoming nothing. They curled inward and began to fade, their ancient minds retreating from a fear too old and too deep to fight. But the humans did something different. Admiral Tanaka stood at the front of her soldiers, and the thought feeder poured nightmares into her mind with the force of 1,000 dying stars. She saw her daughter dying in her arms while she watched helplessly. She saw her homeworld burning, cities falling to ash, oceans boiling away to nothing. She saw every failure of her long career, every soldier she could not save, every decision that cost lives, every moment of doubt and weakness and regret. Tanaka screamed, a raw and broken sound that tore from her throat like something alive, and tears streamed down her face, and her hands shook so badly she could barely hold her weapon. But her feet kept moving. Step by step, the Admiral walked forward into the darkness, into the fear, into the nightmare that no sane being would choose to enter. "Forward," she shouted, and her voice cracked but did not break. "Keep moving forward." Her soldiers followed. They cried and they shook, and they made sounds of terror that HFY had never imagined humans could make. One young soldier vomited on the floor and then wiped his mouth and kept walking. Another dropped to her knees and prayed to gods HFY did not know, and then she stood up and ran to catch up with her squad. A third soldier, an old man with more scars than smooth skin, began reciting poetry through chattering teeth, ancient words about death and courage and the darkness between stars. Diego was beside HFY, and the young corporal was shaking so badly it seemed like he might fall apart. His face was wet with tears, and his breath came in gasps that sounded painful, and his eyes were wide with a terror that went deeper than words. "I cannot move," HFY said, and the words came out strange and wrong because the ambassador had never felt this frozen helplessness before. "I cannot think, I cannot function." Diego grabbed the Silithan's crystalline arm, with hands that trembled but did not let go. "Then hold on to me," he said, "and I will move for both of us." He pulled HFY forward, dragging the frozen ambassador along as he walked into the nightmare with the rest of his species. The thought feeder noticed. After 1,000,000 years of feeding on the minds of countless species, the ancient entity had never encountered prey like this. Other beings broke when fear touched them. They ran, or they froze, or they turned on each other, or they simply died as their minds collapsed under the weight of their own terror. But these small, soft creatures, these humans, they kept coming. The entity pushed harder, showing them worse horrors, deeper fears, memories they had buried and futures they dreaded. A soldier saw himself becoming his abusive father, saw the cycle of pain continuing through his children and his children's children. He screamed and then said through his tears, "Not me, never me, I chose different and I keep choosing different." A medic saw everyone she had ever failed to save standing before her with accusing eyes, and she fell to her knees and sobbed. Then she stood up and said with a shaking voice, "That is why I keep trying, that is why I never stop, because every save matters." A young private saw the vast emptiness of space and felt the crushing loneliness of being a tiny spark of life in an uncaring universe. He laughed, actually laughed, and shouted, "We made it this far, you cosmic horror. We crawled out of the mud and reached the stars, and one scary space jellyfish is not going to stop us now." The thought feeder had fed on fear for longer than most species had existed, and it had always found that fear was pure and simple and easy to consume. But human fear was different. Human fear was tangled up with other emotions, with hope and rage and love and stubborn spite, and something that the entity could not identify, something that burned where it should have been cold. For the first time in 1,000,000 years, the thought feeder felt something that might have been confusion. Diego ran now, pulling HFY along, and he shouted a war cry that the translator in the ambassador's mind struggled to process. The words meant something like, "Not this day," or "You will not win today," or simply "No," repeated with the force of an entire species refusing to surrender. Behind them, some humans fell, minds broken, hearts stopped, bodies collapsing as fear finally found the cracks in their armor. But for every human who fell, 5 more stepped over them and kept moving, kept fighting, kept refusing to stop even as tears and terror and the weight of nightmares pressed down on them. And deep in the core of the station, where the thought feeder had begun to take physical form, something impossible happened. The ancient entity, the horror that had consumed civilizations, the fear eater that had never known anything but hunger and satisfaction, began to feel something new. It was not fear, not exactly, because the thought feeder did not know how to be afraid. But it was close. It was doubt. The heart of the station had become something that was no longer a place. It had become a wound in reality, where the thought feeder was forcing itself into physical existence. Admiral Tanaka led her soldiers toward it, and with every step the nightmares grew worse, and the air grew colder, and the lights flickered in patterns that hurt to look at. "What is the plan?" Sergeant Chen shouted over the sound of minds breaking all around them. "Psychic entities feed on emotional energy," Tanaka replied, and her voice was rough from screaming but still strong enough to carry. "They consume it and grow stronger from it." "So we starve it?" Diego asked as he continued to drag HFY's frozen form along with him. "No," the Admiral said, and something like a grim smile crossed her face. "We overfeed it, we give it so much human fear, so much human emotion that it chokes." The plan seemed insane to HFY, but the Silithan ambassador could do nothing but watch as the humans gathered their courage and prepared to weaponize their own terror. They pushed deeper into the station, stepping over the bodies of aliens who had collapsed, moving past walls that seemed to breathe and floors that felt soft in a way that no metal should feel. The casualties mounted. A soldier named Rodriguez fell and did not get up, his heart stopped by a vision of his daughter dying that was so real he believed it completely. 2 Marines went mad and turned on each other, each seeing the other as a monster from their worst nightmares, and their squad mates had to knock them unconscious and carry them. A young medic named Okonkwo simply sat down and refused to move, her mind finally breaking under the weight of every patient she had ever lost coming back to blame her. But the others kept going, kept fighting, kept refusing to stay down. The thought feeder tried new tactics. Instead of showing the humans their personal fears, it showed them something else. It showed them humanity itself. They saw their own history, the dark parts, the shameful parts, the parts that made even proud humans look away. They saw wars where millions died for nothing, where children were killed and cities were burned, and hatred consumed entire generations. They saw genocides and cruelties, slave ships and concentration camps, weapons that could end all life and the willingness to use them. They saw the worst of their species, and the thought feeder expected them to break under the weight of their own collective shame. For a moment they faltered. Even Admiral Tanaka stumbled, and her face twisted with pain that went deeper than any nightmare about herself. But then Sergeant Chen laughed, a bitter sound, broken and sharp. "You think we do not know this?" she shouted into the darkness that surrounded them. "You think we have forgotten? We remember every terrible thing we have ever done because that is why we keep fighting." A corporal named William stepped forward with tears streaming down his face. "We carry our shame," he said. "We teach it to our children, we build monuments to our failures, because remembering is how we try to be better." The concept confused the thought feeder. Every other species it had encountered tried to forget their darkest moments, tried to bury them, and when the entity dug those memories up, the species broke under the rediscovered weight. But humans did not bury their shame. They carried it openly, used it as a reminder, transformed it into something that drove them forward instead of holding them back. Guilt transformed into purpose was not something the thought feeder knew how to consume. They reached the core. The entity had manifested partially into physical space, and what Kithvari saw through frozen crystalline eyes was something that the ambassador's logical mind refused to accept. It was an absence, a hole in reality, a darkness that was somehow blacker than black and deeper than deep. It writhed and pulsed like something alive, and it spoke in voices, thousands of voices, millions of voices, all the voices of everyone who had ever been lost to it. "You cannot fight us," the voices said. "You cannot win against fear itself. You will break like all the others. You will feed us like all the others." Admiral Tanaka stepped forward alone. Her soldiers tried to stop her, but she waved them back and walked toward the writhing darkness with steps that did not falter. The thought feeder focused all its power on her, showing her the worst fears it could find in her mind. Her daughter dead in 100 different ways. Her homeworld destroyed in 1,000 variations. Her own face twisted with madness as she became something she hated. Every doubt, every regret, every moment of weakness, amplified until it filled her entire mind with nothing but terror. Tanaka reached into her pocket and pulled out a small photograph. Her daughter, smiling, holding a cat that was trying to escape her arms. "You think showing me my fears will stop me?" she asked, and her voice shook but did not break. The entity pressed harder, and Tanaka fell to her knees. But she did not stop talking. "My fears are why I move," she said. "My fears are why I protect. My fears are why I am here instead of running away." She held up the photograph with a hand that trembled so badly, the image was just a blur. "You are not showing me my weakness," she said. "You are reminding me what I am fighting for." She turned to her soldiers, and her face was wet with tears and twisted with terror, but her eyes burned with something that the thought feeder could not understand. "Now," she commanded. And the humans attacked, not with weapons but with their minds. They stopped trying to suppress their fear, and instead they released it, all of it, letting it pour out of them in a flood of raw emotion. But it was not just fear. It was fear tangled with hope that things could be better. It was fear mixed with rage at everything that threatened what they loved. It was fear combined with love so fierce that it burned brighter than any star. It was fear twisted together with stubborn spite, the simple refusal to give up even when giving up made sense. The thought feeder had fed on countless species across 1,000,000 years, and fear had always tasted the same, cold and pure and simple. But human fear tasted wrong. It tasted like fire and ice at the same time, like joy and sorrow mixed together, like a song played in a key that should not exist. The entity tried to consume it, but the emotions contradicted each other and fought each other and refused to be digested. HFY watched as the ancient horror began to writhe in a new way, not with hunger but with something like pain. The fears it consumed were fighting back from the inside. And the humans did not stop. They kept feeding it their terror, their hope, their rage, their love, their desperate laughing refusal to surrender, until the thought feeder understood something that shattered its 1,000,000-year certainty. It had made a mistake. It had chosen the wrong prey. The thought feeder tried to retreat. For the first time in 1,000,000 years, the ancient entity that had consumed civilizations and devoured minds and existed as the ultimate predator of thinking beings, tried to run away. But Admiral Tanaka saw it pulling back, saw the darkness beginning to shrink and withdraw, and she shouted an order that echoed through the broken corridors of the station. "Do not let it escape." The humans surged forward, and they were crying and shaking and making sounds of terror that proved just how afraid they were. But they did not stop. Diego released HFY and ran toward the retreating darkness with a scream that the translator in the ambassador's mind rendered as something ancient and wild. A sound that humans had made when they were still hunting mammoths with spears made of stone. "You want my fear," he shouted at the writhing absence. "Take it, take all of it. I have enough fear to drown you, and I will still be standing when you choke on it." The thought feeder had never heard words like this, had never encountered prey that offered themselves so freely and so fiercely. It tried to consume the fear Diego was offering, tried to use that fear to break him as it had broken countless others. But Diego's fear came wrapped in something the entity could not digest. His fear was bound to his love for his family back on Earth. His fear was chained to his pride in the uniform he wore. His fear was twisted together with his stubborn human belief that being scared was not a good enough reason to stop trying. The thought feeder choked. All around it, humans were pressing forward, each one offering their fear like a weapon aimed at the entity's heart. A soldier named Park screamed about her fear of failing her dead father, but that fear was poisoned with her determination to make him proud anyway. A Marine named Johnson roared about his fear of dying alone, but that fear was infected with his love for the brothers and sisters in arms who surrounded him. A medic named Chen wept about her fear of not being good enough, but that fear was contaminated with her refusal to stop trying to be better. The contradictions tore at the thought feeder from the inside. It had evolved to consume pure emotions, simple feelings, the clean terror of beings who had not learned to mix their fears with fiercer things. But human emotions were never pure, never simple, never clean. Humans could be terrified and hopeful at the same time. They could despair and still fight. They could accept that they were going to die and use that acceptance to find the courage to keep living for one more minute, one more second, one more breath. The entity began to come apart. Not physically, it had no physical form to destroy, but psychically, spiritually, in whatever way a being of pure thought could be torn to pieces. The fears it had consumed were rebelling, attacking it from within, and for every fear it tried to digest, 3 more came flooding in to replace it. Admiral Tanaka stood before the dying horror, and she was shaking so badly she could barely stand, and tears still ran down her face, and her voice was raw from screaming. But she smiled. "You picked the wrong species," she said. "You picked the ones who learned to use their fear instead of being used by it." The thought feeder made one last attempt to strike at her mind, and it showed her the ultimate fear, the certainty that nothing she did mattered, that the universe was cold and empty and uncaring, that humanity was just a brief flicker of light that would be forgotten. Tanaka nodded. "Maybe," she said, "maybe none of it matters in the end. Maybe we are just small and temporary and insignificant." She stepped closer to the writhing darkness. "But we matter to each other," she said, "and that is enough. That has always been enough. That is why we keep going." The thought feeder could not understand this. How could beings accept their own insignificance and still find meaning? How could they acknowledge the darkness of the universe and still choose to be lights within it? How could they be so afraid and still so defiant? It could not understand, and that failure to understand was the final crack in its ancient existence. The entity that had terrorized the galaxy for 1,000,000 years died screaming, not with the screams of its victims, but with its own voice, making sounds of confusion and pain that no being had ever heard from a thought feeder before. And then it was gone. The darkness lifted, the nightmares faded, and the station was just a station again, damaged and broken, but real in a way it had not been for hours. HFY could move again. The Sci-Fi ambassador stumbled as crystalline limbs remembered how to function, and the sensation of fear slowly drained away like water running out of a cracked vessel. Diego was there, catching the ambassador before HFY could fall, and the young soldier was still crying, but he was also laughing. "We did it," he said. "We actually did it." All around them, humans were collapsing, not from defeat but from exhaustion, from the release of tension that had kept them moving through impossible terror. They held each other and wept and laughed, and some of them just sat in silence, staring at nothing as their minds slowly accepted that they had survived. HFY sat with Diego as medical teams began to arrive, as ships that had fled returned to help, as the news of what had happened spread through the coalition. "How do you do it?" the ambassador asked. Diego looked at the crystalline being with tired eyes that had seen too much. "Do what?" "Live with fear," HFY said. "Every day knowing it is there, feeling it constantly. How do you function?" Diego thought about this for a long moment before answering. "We do not live with it," he said finally. "We live through it. Fear tells us what matters, and then we protect what matters." He smiled, exhausted and tear-stained, and more human than HFY had ever understood before. "That is the whole species, really," Diego said. "Just a bunch of scared animals who decided that being scared was not a good enough reason to stop." Months later, HFY returned to the Sci-Fi homeworld to deliver a report on what had happened at the Constellation Accord. The Council of Elders gathered in the Great Chamber, their crystalline bodies catching the light of 100 suns, and they asked the question that the entire species wanted answered. "What did you learn about humans?" HFY thought about Diego and Admiral Tanaka, about soldiers who screamed with terror and charged forward anyway, about a species that carried its fears like weapons instead of wounds. And the ambassador spoke words that would become famous across the entire galactic coalition. "Do not pity humans their fears," HFY said. "Do not mock their short lives or their fragile bodies." The crystalline being paused, remembering the darkness and the horror and the impossible courage of beings who could feel terror in every cell of their bodies and still refuse to stop. I have seen what dwells in the dark between stars, Kithvari continued, and I have seen what humans do when they face it. The council listened in silence. They scream, the ambassador said. They weep, they tremble with fear so strong that their bodies shake and their hearts struggle to beat. Kithvari's voice grew stronger. And then, impossibly, inexplicably, they attack. The great chamber was utterly silent. They are not brave despite their fear, Kithvari declared. They are brave because of it. The ambassador looked at the elders who had never known terror, who could not understand the thing they had never felt. If the void ever returns, Kithvari said, pray the humans stand with you, because they will stand long after every other species has fled or fallen. The Silithan's crystalline form caught the light of 100 stars and scattered it into rainbows. They will stand, Kithvari repeated, shaking, terrified, and utterly unbreakable. And across the galaxy, in every place where the story was told, beings of 1,000 species learned to look at humans with new eyes. Not as the young species, not as the soft and emotional ones, not as the primitives who had only recently reached the stars, but as the ones who had learned the greatest lesson that the universe could teach. Fear was not the enemy. Fear was the fire that forged courage, the darkness that defined light, the weight that made rising again mean something. And humans, terrified, stubborn, impossible humans, had built their entire civilization on the simple truth that being afraid was never, ever a good enough reason to stop.